Vijay Gamadawa. My name is Matthew Thomas, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. And I'll be presenting our co-authored paper today entitled Zambian Pre-Service Teachers' Experiences of Sociology of Education, Exploring Theory for Future Teaching Practice. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this video today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's also upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this is a co-authored paper, but unfortunately my two colleagues were not able to present at CIES. So I'll now turn to a pre-recorded video to let them introduce themselves.
Okay. My name is Ferdinand. I'm affiliated with the Department of Education Administration and Policy Studies at the School of Education. My areas of research are basically higher education identities, political economy of higher education, how higher education intersects with the economic landscape, the political landscape, the ideological landscape of the country.
Great.
Hello, I'm Janet Serenje-Chipindi. I'm a lecturer of Sociology of Education in the Department of Education Psychology, Sociology and Special Education at the University of Zambia. I have a Bachelor of Education in Special Education, a Master of Education in Sociology of Education. I'm currently pursuing a PhD in Sociology of Education, focusing on early childhood education. I'm interested in teacher education. I also do research in Sociology of Education and, of course, early childhood education.
So now that we know a little bit about the co-authors of this paper, I should say that we've been friends and collaborators and colleagues for a long time. And through these conversations of working together, we realized that Janet and I were coordinating very similar courses or units at our different institutions, the University of Zambia and the University of Sydney. And these were large mandatory sociology of education courses that were required courses for students in pre-primary, primary, and secondary teacher education programs, primarily second-year students. And we were curious, how did our units compare? What did they look like? And so we began by looking at the syllabi and doing kind of a deep dive comparative document analysis of the syllabus at the University of Zambia and the syllabus at the University of Sydney. What were the topics? How were they taught? What was the instructional system for going through these different issues in sociology of education? And this culminated in a book chapter, shameless plug, in this excellent book about course syllabi within Faculty of Education. You're welcome to look that if you want to look that up if you want to learn more about that. But for today's purpose, I'd like to focus on the Zambian case for this paper. And I'll preface this by saying that this is certainly a work in progress across the three of us as authors, but we're really pursuing two core lines of inquiry. The first is, how do pre-service teachers experience sociology of education at the University of Zambia, and how do they perceive its value for their future work as teachers in presumably or primarily Zambian classrooms? So we know that a lot of time is spent in teacher education, taking a number of different courses, including social foundations courses, such as sociology of education. How are students experiencing that? What did they see as the key takeaways? So we're framing this work through sociology, not surprising, but sociological investigations of education, especially teaching and teacher education. So of course Dan Lordy's famous idea of the apprenticeship of observation, that we spend so much time sitting in classrooms, sometimes we presume that we know how to be a teacher. But of course those are very different things. As Deborah Britzman would say, while familiarity with the teacher's work does matter, it is not a direct line to insight. In other words, being a student and being a teacher are fundamentally different things. And Darling Hammond takes it a step further by saying that much of what teachers need to know to be successful is invisible to lay observers, leading to the view that teaching requires little formal study and a frequent disdain for teacher education programs. So this is helping to frame some of our thinking about this particular project. But we also looked into research specifically on the teaching of sociology of education, which, to be honest, there isn't a whole lot, but it is a growing field. There's a number of studies from North America, Europe, a couple in Australia, Brazil, a couple other locations as well. But scant studies from lower income countries, including sub-Saharan Africa, a couple from Nigeria just in the recent years, South Africa, and there are a couple other spaces. But we really want to see more research in this space, particularly because, as I said, students spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. It's part and parcel of many teacher education programs. We need to think more strategically about what's taking place in these courses. So for our study, it was conducted at UNZA, as I said, which was established in 1965, just following Zambia's independence. And within the School of Education specifically, this course or unit was a 15-week Sociology of Education course. It had about 1,250 students enrolled, mostly second year, as I said earlier. And because there were so many students, 1,257, they split them up into 3 different streams. And then the course comprised a lecture and a tutorial component. And you can see this is the New Education Lecture Theater, the NELT, or the NELT, as my Zambian colleagues would call it. This is where the lectures take place, and you'll see some of the students reference this in the data that we'll get to right now. So we did get to we did implement a mixed methods design with 318 survey respondents, as well as focus groups with 20 students split up across a number of focus groups. We also conducted a focus group with the tutors who were helping out in the unit, as well as we as researchers kept reflections and field note observations to gain more nuanced insights. Here are some examples of some of those field notes. And then, of course, through data analysis, a lot of virtual communication to analyze and process the data and think about what it means, as well as some opportunities for us to work together in person in Zambia, pre-COVID, obviously. But I'd like to highlight 4 key research findings from the study. The first is that the students in this particular unit actually came up with fairly strong sociological insights. So one of the survey questions asked, what are the key elements of sociology of education? So, now that you've taken this unit, what does it mean? What is this? And so I took all of the data from the Excel database and from answering this question and threw it into a word cloud. And here it is. I think it's actually fairly nuanced. I'll give you a second to read that. As somebody who works in sociology of education, I'd say this captures sociology of education fairly well. Interaction, relationship, society, social, community, behavior, relationship, socialization, so many of these concepts that we talk about quite frequently in sociology of education. And this came through in the focus groups as well. So Chimunya said, I think sociology of ed was all about shaping us as teachers and how we relate to the community and the pupils. The community can affect what happens in schools, and the schools can also affect what happens in the community. So quite nuanced for a second-year undergraduate pre-service teacher, and I think that was quite encouraging. A second finding then was that they often found and made connections to specific aspects of their work in the future. So from the survey, 98.7% of respondents believe sociology of education helps prepare them for their future work as teachers, just in general. But beyond that, there was an identification and rejection of deficit perspectives vis-a-vis labeling theory and other aspects of social stratification. So these were some of the topics that were addressed in this sociology of education unit. And the students, the respondents, really felt that it helps them prevent certain detrimental approaches as classroom teachers in the future because they had a greater awareness of some of the social patterns and the broader impacts of these types of things. Mulea, one of the students, said, schools play a major role in the socialization of pupils. And so what we found was that students and the respondents were much more attentive because they had a greater understanding of how socialization occurs and what can be its impacts, positive, negative, or neutral. Students were also really interested in the roles and status of teachers. This was one of the topics addressed in Sociology of Education, this course, particularly in a historical perspective, thinking about the decline of the status of the teaching profession within Zambia. And this actually led to a lot of demotivating comments from the respondents. And so that's something that we as co-authors thought maybe could be addressed in a different way in the future, where the analysis could still take place, but perhaps also some strategies to encourage these pre-service teachers to continue on in the teaching profession. The pre-service teachers also found that there were really strong theoretical tools for understanding schools and society. Mercy, a focus group student, said, "The thing is, we've been pupils before. We have seen what happens. In sociology, we have been able to relate some of the topics to what was happening. So we will relate better in classrooms now that we know what happens and why it happens." And of course, in my brain, all I could think about were these ideas of apprenticeship of observation and this changing identity from student to teacher. And here, this particular respondent was talking about, the ability to shift and to understand, even though they had lived through it as a student, now they could understand it on a more theoretical level as a teacher and explain it and try to prevent certain negative consequences. Thirdly, there were common challenges, and some of these I thought were quite interesting given my work at the University of Sydney as well. Drawing on Schulman's idea of pedagogical content knowledge, we noticed that there were certain common misconceptions, and we would argue that teacher educators are probably better off if there's some type of professional learning or professional development to try to prevent these misconceptions. I think Schulman calls it a virtual armamentarium of alternative explanations, how to explain things in a variety of ways to prevent misconceptions. The first is a really common one that I experienced at the University of Sydney, and this is a tension between sociological and psychological orientations, that the students don't quite understand the disciplinary differences. Maybe not a huge deal for their teaching practice, but certainly interesting to think about. And related to this idea of moving between theory and practice, that theory helps us explain things, but all practices are underpinned by some type of theory, whether we acknowledge it or not. And finally, we noticed that there was a fair degree of unevenness in the tutorial experiences, that some students had a really rich tutorial experience where they were exploring these topics in greater details, and others not so much. And so we'd like to understand that more and try to prevent that to make sure that all students have a high-quality learning experience. Finally, it's I think necessary to talk about some of the material constraints that we noticed. A lot of the participants in this study talked about the crowded lecture hall. So Felix says one has to stand in a queue for an hour. After that, one has to stand again in the lecture hall. So because there aren't enough seats, students queue for an hour, but they may not even get a seat even if they queue for that long. And that also connected to this idea of a crowded curriculum, that there was a lot to address in a 15-week unit, and students wanted more time to engage with these sociological understandings of education. And certainly there are certain challenges for the coordination of a large unit for Janet and for her colleagues who coordinate it. Here you can see a picture from one of several examination halls for the final examination, just rows and rows of desks. And the exams needed to be moderated or invigilated, making sure that there's no cheating. But just from a coordination perspective, a lot of logistics to manage for these teacher educators. And finally, I think it's important to acknowledge that the staff were largely overworked. So after the exams, here's an example of all of the exams. I think this is maybe not even all of them, just some of the exams that came out of that large examination hall that were all marked by hand, of course, not marked through Turnitin or electronically. And just a huge, huge time commitment for these teacher educators. So that leads us then to the discussion, and we just want to begin by reiterating that we think it's really important to understand pre-service teachers' experiences in sociology of education or social foundations more broadly. And that certainly there are implications for curricula and pedagogy. We want to think through how can we better tailor sociology of education for future teachers. What does it look like to make these stronger connections between theory and practice? And how can we think about revising the curriculum or reforming the way that it's structured so that students come out with a really strong understanding of what their teaching practice looks like and how it's underpinned or informed by various theories. And as I mentioned or alluded to earlier, this idea of professional development for tutors or lecturers, knowing that they're overworked, but also that they're teaching a number of different units, how can we provide some support for these teacher educators to do this vital work of preparing these pre-service teachers? And we think it's particularly important in teacher education where pre-service teachers are being inculcated into and literally socialized into different ways of teaching and learning, that we need to model very carefully in teacher education the type of pedagogical practice that we would like to see them implement and enact in their classrooms in the future. So in future directions, we would just encourage more research on sociology of education, social foundations within teacher education specifically. And we think longitudinal studies that follow some pre-service teachers into their schools would be really amazing, as well as some additional observational work in teacher education and beyond. And then finally, we're working on another paper where we're reconsidering the content. So what are some localized approaches to sociology of education that might be warranted and useful? And how can we further decolonize the curriculum? So those are some of the things we're working on and thinking about at the moment. Here's a list of our references, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you have any comments, questions, or connections. Thanks so much. Bye.